Thank you very much for this invitation. So I'm going to talk about Ambedkar and the idea of equality, and I'm going to speak of 4 types of equality which are all part of the larger idea of equality. So I'll go over each of them one by one, and I'll correlate each of these types with a particular historical phase of both Ambedkar's social and political trajectory as the greatest, arguably, activist in the cause of social justice and equality, but also a phase of his thinking in the history, in the trajectory of his thinking. So the 4 types of equality that I'm going to talk about, which will hopefully bring out the larger idea of equality, are, and I've listed them out, predicative equality, axiomatic equality, generic equality, and dispositional equality. So before I explain each of them, just a few remarks by way of introduction. First of all, these types are not meant to be proper conceptually very, very rigorously different concepts of equality. As I said, they all belong to the larger idea of equality. To that extent, these are schematizations. These are only schemas. These are only tentative images of equality to differentiate their variations. That's all. We should not take them to be 4 separate concepts. That's the first point. And the second point is that I'm speaking of the idea of equality, which means I'm speaking, let's say, philosophically. I'm not really speaking about a particular kind of theory of equality or a theory of justice that comes from a definition of equality. So again, there is no definition of equality that I am proposing or I am committing myself to from which a theory of justice flows, which, for instance, is the preoccupation of sociology, sociological theories of justice, several of which are very famous, and students of sociology and political philosophy learn and discuss them. That is not really what I'm doing. What I'm doing is to make sense of these different schemas so as to arrive at a tentative idea of equality, which in itself does not have a completely defined closure or a defined boundary, but definitely does indicate the directions in which, let's say, the further consequences of this idea can be drawn for real politics or real social change. Yeah. So this is something I'd like to be very clear about. So by this meaning, I'm speaking philosophically. Because philosophy, if it means anything, it means to be attentive to the possibility of thinking of ideas, rather than thinking of ideas as they are applied directly to how those ideas have to be translated into policy or action. But of course, every idea does have real consequences for policy and action. So for the moment, let's speak of the idea, and then in the discussion we can take up the different consequences for our times. The historical part of this, which is Ambedkar's own historical position, is key to this lecture, because I'm not saying that the idea of equality that I am trying to schematize for you here is something that has come to me from some sort of a pure deductive reasoning or some pure inspiration or from some pure scientific thinking about equality that I have initiated. The ideas themselves come from several experiments with actual efforts to try out what could be called an equal life between different parts of society, different members of society, to try out an equal way of living together and interacting with each other, and to that extent experiments in a life of equality. But the experiments in life of equality are also experiments in the thinking about equality. So there is clearly a two-way reciprocal relationship between thinking of equality and living equally. And Ambedkar is one of the exemplary figures around which and who himself did this kind of a reciprocal all his life, a reciprocal a kind of reciprocal circuit that he opened up between thinking about equality and living an equal life. In the location that he was born in, which of course brings up the question of caste, because he was born in what was at that time openly known as an untouchable caste, the Mahar caste. Today, of course, untouchability is a crime by law, which doesn't mean untouchability does not exist. But Ambedkar himself, born in a what customary Hindu law accepted as untouchability, and born in an untouchable caste, had the courage to try out living a life of equality with the other castes, and at the same time, because that was impossible in practice, being born in the lowest rung of the caste structure, he had to, in a sense, force a thought of equality in a life which was fundamentally unequal. So then the thought of equality is also a certain kind of force against a life of inequality. So it's not simply a harmony between the life of equality and the thought of equality. Thought of equality in certain real conditions of society also becomes a force against a life of inequality. So then thought also has a relationship of something like an opposition, a dialectic, a certain material argument with life itself. So thought argues with life. Ambedkar, in a sense, is that figure where thought argued with life all the time. So this is by way of introduction. So now let's go over these four types, schemas of equality one by one. The first type that I am calling a predicative equality, I should also say that this terminology, the words that I use are mine. So you cannot say that the terminology, the jargon, if you want to call it that, comes from Ambedkar. Though of course the words also do occur in Ambedkar, and I'll cite those sources a little bit. But by and large, these words are mine, so I take responsibility for the jargon. But I'll try to make the jargon as clear as possible in common ordinary language. And that's why I also take the help of the whiteboard. So the first one, predicative equality. Now, a predicate is, of course, as we all know, something that you attach to a subject. So when you say that that X is A, or whichever way you want to put it, then A in a sense is an attribute of X, or A can be also used as a predicate of the subject X. So you say that I am sad. So to that extent, sad is an attribution of me, whoever I am, and you can say a sad person. So then sad also becomes a certain kind of predication. To that extent, the word equal has to be then used as a predicate. So you say X is equal, but then clearly such a predicate is incomplete, because you need a transitive verb there. Yeah, equal to what? There has to be some transitivity, otherwise it's an incomplete sentence, incomplete proposition to say X is equal. Clearly you need to then further extend that statement proposition to X is equal to Y. But even that is incomplete, because then you will ask the question, X is equal to Y in what respect? Yeah. How is X equal to Y? In that sense, the predicate is actually something which then becomes a kind of parameter, a kind of measure of equality. And of course, it is also a historical site of a certain kind of contestation, that is there equality in this particular manner, in this particular respect between, say, two subjects, X and Y, becomes a real question. So that example in our times is something which we deal with all the time. For instance, we speak of economic equality, social equality, religious equality. In Ambedkar's own time, the question was that much more heightened. Caste inequality being one of the primary realities of Indian society, Hindu Indian society at that time. The question of equality, of course, arose there. That how is it possible to even imagine an equal society where structurally society was deeply, highly unequal by the virtue of it being a caste society? That is obvious. But in the real social and political movements that were taking place, particularly from the kind of end of 1920s to 1930s, at least up to 1935, one of the examples where this kind of an equality with respect to a particular predicate, which is the predicate of religious, became a subject of intense historical, almost militancy, was what is called the temple entry movement. Now, we will be able to recognize this temple entry movement today in our context very clearly, because we know recently the temple entry movement was carried out for the rights of women to enter temples, Hindu temples particularly, where women are not allowed in our own country. So Sabrimala, for instance, and other temples. So a lot of women, large number of women, but also led by certain women activists and also men, have been fighting for the right of temple entry in our times, very recently, we know that. This actually started with respect to caste a long time back. Women not so much at that time, but caste definitely. So in the 1920s and 1930s in Maharashtra and in other places, in south of India also, there was a very, very strong movement to enforce equality for the lower castes such that they were able to enter Hindu temples. And not just temples, also one of the sites, one of the things on which the Hindu priestly class, the Brahmanical class, enforced tremendous discrimination on untouchables was the roads, the public roads, the public ways which were on the way to the temple. So suppose there is a road, this is a temple and there is a road from outside, even this way was prohibited for the untouchable classes. So even walking on that road, forget coming into the temple, even walking on that road which was to the temple, which was a way to the temple, was prohibited. So temple entry movement was not just temple entry, it was also a fight to be allowed to use public roads, public ways at that time. So in 1920s and 1930s, up to 1935-36 at least, temple entry was a tremendous social and political movement, historically speaking, at that time. But I don't want to go too much into the details of history. Point is, what kind of an equality is being asked for when someone is asking, say the women today are asking for women to be allowed into temples where traditionally customary law says women are not allowed. And traditionally customary law used to say at that time lower castes are not allowed, and so on. So what kind of an equality is this in terms of the schema of the idea of equality? Now clearly you could say that people are asking for the right to enter as a part of religious equality. So a predicate is being used. So the statement then, if you go back to the statement x equal to y and so on and so forth, you will see that here the empirical statement is that lower castes are equal to upper castes with respect to religious worship or religious entry or religious access to the gods of that religion, Hinduism here. So this is a clear predicate. So it is not really simply a question of equality in some open sense. It is a very specific predicate that we are talking about. The predicate of religious. With respect to the religious predicate, the attribute, is there equality? If there is no equality, what do you do about it? So of course, very clearly in the 1920s and 30s, there is a real activist movement. The lower castes are gathering together and they are asking for that of the Brahmanical priests, the different kinds of upper caste priests. They are also asking the government to intervene, just like today the women are asking the government to intervene and through law make a new law which says all people are allowed, of whoever is born Hindu, into these temples. Yeah. So it's also clearly a right of minorities within a religion to be allowed access to all the places of religious worship. So again, a predicate is involved here, the predicate of religious. This can be extended to other things. Religious, of course, also means social in the larger sense. But economic equality very clearly is a tremendous example, very, very hotly debated in relation to predicative equality. So people would say, let's not bother too much with some vague, philosophy of equality or some profound, deep metaphysical idea of equality. Let's talk about real equality, which is with respect to, let's say, income. Yeah. Some people get a lot of money, some people don't earn, have no money at all. Let's try and make that equality come true in society. So economic equality becomes a question of a predicative equality with respect to the income. That is a predicate. Just like with respect to temple entry, it's a religious equality. With respect to something else, for instance, social exclusion, people who are not allowed into certain kinds of social spaces, which again in the case of untouchables was at that time at least a very, very clear case of spatial social exclusion, that untouchables were not allowed into certain kinds of market spaces, not allowed into certain homes of upper castes and so on, while these people were working in upper caste homes. So certain areas were allowed, certain areas were not allowed, and so on and so forth. So food, for instance, the kitchen space is one of the critical sides of this kind of spatial social exclusion. So in each of these cases, it is a predicate that is involved: social, political, economic, religious, and so on and so forth, cultural, educational. So one of the things on which predicative equality is a matter of tremendous interest is, of course, the issue of reservation. So reservation, when it was finally, it actually started much earlier, from the 1920s itself, reservation policy of the British government. But after 1947, reservation as part of independent India is in a way a measure, a specific measure to try and address the issue of predicative inequality. So with respect to, let's say, education, there is inequality, so let's try and bring reservation. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but whatever way you want to bring reservation, you try and correct that predicate with respect to the predicate. So it's measurable. Basically, predicative equality is measurable. It's statistical. You can say that X number of people after reservation were able to come into the kind of net of education with the other castes and communities, or they were not. So you can always also measure the failure of a certain policy with predicative equality. So some people will say, look, it has not helped. So that debate can go on, but at least analytically speaking, it can only be carried out with respect to the predicate. I'm talking about this, which is of course very obvious to all of you, because this has to be differentiated from the other types of equality. Because with a predicate, you are clearly speaking, to some extent at least, in the instrumental realm, in the instrumental domain. You are saying there is an instrument which we must take care of vis-a-vis equality, vis-a-vis the idea of equality. And for that, we might use other measures like a reservation or anything else. So these are all measurable indices or measurable parameters through which a certain idea of predicative equality is thought about. But to begin with, these are not born from some analytical clarification or analytical games of equality that we play. These are born from a historical struggle. So the temple entry movement is a real historical struggle that happens in the 1920s and 1930s. Interestingly, Gandhi is somebody who is deeply interested in the temple entry movement. Gandhi thinks that a lot of ills and difficulties of Hindu society come from within Hinduism, these practices of discrimination. And so Gandhi is greatly interested that these excluded lower castes and classes be allowed into the Hindu temples. And Gandhi takes great interest in the temple entry movement. And he actually also in the 1930s undertakes a fast to appeal, to put moral pressure on the priestly classes who are disallowing till then the lower caste from entering these temple spaces. But in the 1930s, Ambedkar, who clearly by then was the greatest leader of the lower castes, apart from also being one of the most brilliant thinkers of equality in general, recognized as a great scholar by everybody, all the people in the national movement and otherwise, asked his people, the people around him, to some extent, not focus all their energies on the temple entry movement, not focus all their energies only on the predicative idea of equality. This is interesting. While Gandhi was going all the way to see that something like predicative equality, in this matter religious equality, be to some extent practiced, within Hindu religion, Ambedkar, who was a real victim of all that, asked his fellow activists and others who were with him that don't put all your energies in that, because it is still only a limited idea of equality. It is only one predicate with which we are concerned here, which is religious. Let us not think that the question of inequality can be reduced to either one predicate or another predicate, depending on what is it that concerns you the most, whether it's educational or religious or some other. For Ambedkar then, the stakes of equality have to be raised. This is, I think, a very important point. With Gandhi, to a large extent, he is still focused on that particular predicate with which he is really involved, which is the religious predicate, particularly the Hindu religious predicate. So he is a Hindu reformer. He wants reform within Hindu religion such that Hindu religion becomes more widened in terms of its absorption of all the people. And he concentrates his energies there a lot in the 1930s. Ambedkar also believes in that, but he says, let us not concentrate our energies entirely on that respect and look out for other meanings of equality or raise the stakes of the meaning of equality itself. So that's the first point, which is related to predicative equality. So how would one raise the stakes of equality? What does it mean to say raise the stakes of the meaning or idea of equality? So again, let's correlate the question to an example, with which we come to axiomatic equality. Now in 1927, at a small town near Nashik in Maharashtra, some of you who from Maharashtra might know about it, a place called Mahad. In 1927, which is before the 1930s, the temple entry movement gaining so much popularity, even before that, in 1927, Ambedkar, along with a large number of untouchable, those days the government used to use the terminology of depressed classes. Later the scheduled caste classes term came. It was also there at that time, but depressed classes was the standard terminology used by the British government. So a lot of people from the depressed classes, but the most number of people in that agitation were from the caste to which in which Ambedkar was born, which is the Mahar caste. What the Mahar caste is, we can talk about, but that's not really our concern today. But it was an untouchable caste in Maharashtra, the lowest caste suffering tremendous amounts of social oppression and exclusion. So anyway, so one form of exclusion was again a predicative form of exclusion, which was not access to, like public roads we talked about, not having access to public sources of waterworks, public waterworks. So drinking water. To drink water from a public tank was not allowed for this caste. So this is again a case of predicative equality and inequality. Drinking water is a particular kind of exclusion. So you say this is something which, with respect to a fundamental material necessity, which is drinking water from a public source to which everyone should be allowed, these people are not allowed. So against this, a large number of Mahar people and other caste and other, not just the lower caste, but a lot of upper caste people also came along with Ambedkar, and Ambedkar led that kind of a march or agitation. It is also called a satyagraha. I'm not going to talk about it today, but satyagraha, you will know, is a Gandhian term, is Gandhi's term, not Ambedkar's term primarily, it's Gandhi's term. Ambedkar himself used the word satyagraha at this point. Anyway, so all of them go to this town, Mahad, and there from a public tank called Chavada tank, they drink water. They transgress the Brahmanical, the upper caste prohibition that you are not allowed to drink water from here. Only the upper castes are allowed because of the customary understanding that drinking water will impurify the upper castes, will create impurity for the upper castes. So they violate that, they transgress it by publicly drinking water. That is the first militant transgression, social militancy. And at that point, I think on the 20th March, the 19th and 20th March are 2 days on which the first phase of the Mahad Satyagraha is carried out. So I think on 20th March, Ambedkar makes a speech. And this speech is something I'd like to cite for you. So on the one hand, the issue is a predicative question, like we saw last time. That temple entry, drinking water, each of these are specific measurable predicates, on which predicate you can measure how much equality has been achieved or not achieved. But Ambedkar exactly at this point makes a speech which basically goes like this, that it is not to drink water that we have come here. It is not to merely do the physical act of violating or transgressing the Brahmanical law against drinking water that we have come here. We could very well have, we have been able to survive even without doing this. Don't think that is the only reason for coming here, that we are doing. And then he goes on to say, we have come here to probably for the first time in Indian history to declare the norm of equality. Now see how the stakes are changed. Now he is not saying what is obvious to all of us, that we have come here to enter the temple. We haven't come here to drink the water which is prohibited to us. We have come here to get the wealth which we are excluded from, or which we are not allowed to take to use for our living and our welfare. He is not saying any of this merely. He is saying we have come here to declare something. Now what is it to declare? To declare means to declare as free speech, as an act of speech. And not just his speech, but collective speech. People who are unequal are declaring for the first time not just their right to equality, their right to drink water, but the norm of equality as such. Now this is something we need to take note of. This is not merely a one predicate on which people are putting all their energies and saying, look, there is injustice being done to us and we are protesting against it, or we are even going to transgress the law and custom and so on and so forth. All that, of course, they are doing. But they are saying, and Ambedkar is saying on behalf of everybody, that what we are doing is declaring a norm of equality in Indian history for the first time, nearly for the first time. Which means what? Which means that we are declaring something at the level of a universal declaration. This is a universal declaration. This is not a declaration only because I am treated unequally. I am of course asking for my rights to be treated equally, but I am also saying there is equality in this world and all of us have to take part in that equality. That is indeed an idea. That is not something which can be only seen through a quantitative statistical parameter or a physical act, whether drinking water or economic equality or social inclusion, all of that of course. But all of that only when the perspective is set by this idea, which is equality. And he is saying it. He is saying the norm of equality for the first time. The first time in Indian history is a huge thing to say. And I quite believe that in modern Indian history, Mahad 1927 is the moment when something like an egalitarian revolution is set off. And till today, we are drawing the consequences of that egalitarian revolution. But I'm not going to go into that. I'm just going to go over the schema. So this is the second. Now, what kind of a declaration would it be when someone says, I declare the norm of equality? Not just for this or that reason, but as a norm, as an idea. Now, you people are scientists, you know about this thing better than me, but as far as I understand it, this is the kind of declaration that a mathematician calls a kind of axiom. What is an axiom? An axiom is a kind of declaration for which there is no proof that is either offered or required. But of course, from an axiom, a lot of theorems will follow. Theorems will follow, which have to be proved, which have to be deduced, which have to be demonstrated. But the demonstration will only take place when these axioms are accepted. And to accept an axiom, first you must take the risk of enforcing it, to declare it. So Ambedkar, in a milieu where clearly real practice is dominantly unequal in Indian society, Hindu society dominantly, is declaring a completely unknown idea or axiom which is that of equality. But he's saying, I am. In any case, if you want to look at the idea of equality in general, how can you ever prove equality? It's not provable. So for instance, if you just change gear and go to gender equality, men and women. Suppose you were to say, I'm going to prove to you that men and women are equal. You can do it from your side. You can say men and women are equal because, let's say, men and women are human beings. You can use one parameter of a higher order, say they are all human beings. So there is human equality, hence men and women are equal. Someone else will say, sure, I accept insofar as they're human, they're equal, but within human they're unequal. How will you then answer this? Why are they unequal? Oh, they'll give some predicative reason that I'm not even going to, quote those reasons, they're so distasteful, but you can imagine what people do. They'll say women just, by virtue of being women physically, they're not equal. Sure, they're okay. As human beings, we are all equal. That's formal. That's okay. But in the real world, women are not equal. Some physical, some things, some distasteful reason people will give. But it's not so easy to disprove that. So you can prove it from your side. Someone else is going to offer another proof, which is a contrary proof, and you can go on forever and ever. This you can do with anything. With anything. How can you ever prove something like equality? This becomes a major problem when you try and show equality at the predicative level and extend the predicate so much that you say, look, I have collected all the predicates of human beings and taken together we will show that human beings are equal. But some predicate will always be left out. So some genetic scientist will come and say, oh, but genetically some people have one quality and some don't. Then you will say, oh, for that predicate genetic, I am afraid we have to accept inequality. So you say, no, they are not unequal, they are different. But then difference can be easily translated in inequality. Say a test is taken, someone is not able to answer the questions with the same speed and efficiency as the other. You say on that they are unequal. So basically to prove equality or inequality is a very, very frustrating affair when you try to do it through predicates, through measures. And hence, on predicates you do it through trying to force both in terms of satyagrahas and agitations and also in terms of argument, a certain kind of social opinion, that opinions must change from the older opinion to the new opinion, from inequality to equality. But that will always happen vis-a-vis some one issue, whether that be temple entry, whether that be educational disqualification, whether that be some other kinds of exclusion. But what Ambedkar is doing in 1927 is something else. He is saying norm of equality as such. And he is even saying something which is so contemptuous of what the patronizing Brahmins or the upper caste would say, that look, we are allowing you and we are joining you in drinking that water which you are prevented from. He said, no, I am not bothered with drinking. I have water enough. I don't have to drink water from this public tank. You guys drink it. But I'll still do it as a symbolic transgression. But what I'm doing really is using this occasion to declare the equality as such. Now this is what I'm calling an axiomatic declaration. The axiom of equality, which has two aspects. One, there is no proof of this axiom, just like an axiom by definition has no proof. But also, historically, what he's saying is, we refuse to show proof. Both these things have to be kept in mind. Not just there is no proof, we also refuse the blackmail of proof. Someone says, no, you show me and we will then grant you. So no. Worth of proof, worth cannot be reduced to proof. And he actually says somewhere that human beings axiomatically have a human worth. That worth is not dependent on proof. There is no proof of worth, but there is worth, insofar as we are humans. That is axiomatic. That is fundamental axiomatic equality. Yeah. So Mahad Satyagraha, this declaration, is a kind of document or a statement which refuses to show proof of worth but declares worth. Yeah. So this is what I am calling the second type, which is axiomatic equality. Now let's go to the third, which is generic equality. Now this is a very tricky part, this is a difficult part. Between axiomatic equality and generic equality, a contemporary French philosopher, communist philosopher, Alain Badiou in France, is doing extraordinary work. He's also a mathematician. He's a great mathematician and a philosopher who is doing extraordinary work on these ideas. So a lot of what I'm saying here is borrowed from, or at least inspired by his work. But anyway, that apart. So this relation between generic and axiomatic is very, very subtle. To all appearances, they are nearly the same. So what is generic is something like universal again. Generic equality is some fundamental equality, basic equality. So what is the difference between axiomatic and generic? Axiomatic is also the same thing, axiom of equality as such. Now, the idea here is that generic equality is to be able to find through particular predicative occasions of both thinking about and arguing for equality and also struggling for politically and socially for equality on the ground in history, taking a real site, a predicative site, a particular site, so predicatives are particulars, and trying to extend that particular into a universal. So using the language of particular to somehow invent an universal, a universal. That is the idea of generic. So generic is a peculiar contradictory kind of a construction of a generic particular. So it's a linguistic issue that I will express the generic through a particular, but it won't be particular. It will go beyond the particular. Now I'll give you a completely, simple, banal example to illustrate this generic particular. So for instance, we do photocopy. We photocopy. Now what do we say mostly? We say Xerox karna hai. Xerox kar lete. Now we know Xerox is a company. It was one of the earliest companies. Now Xerox is a particular. Xerox is not photocopy as the generic idea of reproduction. But we say Xerox. So Xerox is a generic particular because it is a particular company, but it stands for photocopying as such. How has it happened? It has happened through a kind of strange game of language that was played somehow in the history of photocopying. That somehow at some point people started using the word Xerox for photocopying as such. So generic equality then would mean to take a particular occasion of real argument about equality in a real occasion where justice has to be measured predicatively and yet producing a meaning of equality beyond the measure. That is really the most important and the trickiest part of the idea and struggle for equality. Now, for that, I think the Indian Constitution is an excellent example of how a particular constitution, which of course has particular clauses and particular sets of eventually laws meant for particular implementation for the Indian nation, the Indian Constitution. So Indian itself is a predicate, we must remember. India is particular. However much we might say India is eternal and India is everything is India. India is a particular. India is a particular predicate. There is no getting away from that. So Indian Constitution is a particular constitution. And yet, the Indian Constitution can be what it is only if some generic ground or generic value which holds it up can be thought about. Now this is what I think Ambedkar was really trying out in a way which is amazing, and again I don't have the time to discuss his Constituent Assembly speeches, but if you have the time to read his Constituent Assembly speeches, you will see how the universal and the particular task of writing the Indian Constitution came together in a most brilliant and magnificent way. So let me just take one example. In 1949 he made a speech which was a kind of final threshold of the Indian Constitution, the Republic moment of the Indian Republic to be now brought on stage with 26 January. Just before that, he is making a speech where he is now going to introduce the Indian Constitution. Now, of course, the Indian Constitution, the document of free India for the first time, is an occasion of great joy and triumph. And everybody is participating in that moment of tremendous sense of sovereign triumph that we have produced a constitution for ourselves. And at that moment, the architect of the Indian Constitution, the chairman of the drafting committee, says that we have made a great constitution, sure, but you must remember that the constitution can only do so much. The real question is, what is going to happen with the Indian society as it is going to live its constitution in law and in political life? And on that he puts forward a note of great caution. And he says something which is a very famous quote, which is so relevant for our times. He says, and I'm going to just write the two things here. Political democracy or equality or freedom, whichever word you want to use, we have. And social inequality is our reality. So I put that cross deliberately because it is, one is at cross purposes with the other. So he says we have political freedom, political democracy, political equality, and we live in social inequality. And he says the two together either are going to destroy this country, the country is going to lead the life of contradiction. He used, this is his term, life of contradictions. So you can actually read this, this term in a very, very precise way. So it's a life. Indians are going to live a life of contradictions in society, in our families, in our political existence, on the streets, in the universities, in the media, which surrounds us today. Every moment we are going to live a life of contradictions till this tremendous, tremendous opposition between political freedom, political democracy, political equality and social inequality does not resolve itself. And what this life of contradictions is going to lead to in terms of a real consequence, what will happen to our lives, is something one dreads to think of. Ambedkar puts this note of caution at the moment of India's greatest triumph, and justifiably so. It is one of the greatest particular, but I insist, constitutions written in this world, the Indian Constitution. But now, one of the ways of looking at this is to say that political freedom is given by the Constitution, so it is a formal freedom, formal equality in the different articles, and social contradictions are social inequality is a real inequality. Caste, gender, communities, and so on and so forth. Economic, most importantly. But there is a problem here. Now, the problem is, but the Indian Constitution is made, after all, okay, it's made by some enlightened people, and the most enlightened of them all may be Babasaheb Ambedkar, no doubt about that. But still, the Indian Constitution has been made by Indians in this unequal society after all. No one can deny that, it's an obvious fact. Hence, if an idea of political equality or political freedom and political democracy has been enunciated, declared in the Indian Constitution, and law has come from it, from that axiom, as I put it like that, then this must have some reality. How can the idea of equality be simply formal when people have actually thought about it and enunciated it? You see my point? You can't say political equality or equality is only formal because society is unequal. Of course society is unequal, but from this unequal society, people have declared equality. Hence that equality must also have some reality. Otherwise the Indian Constitution would be hollow. And it is not hollow. Hence, for the particular Indian Constitution, something more than Indian is needed. It is not enough to say Indian Constitution. Now, of course, someone can say, oh, it's borrowed from other sources. British Constitution, American Constitution, French, and so on and so forth. British, of course, don't have a written constitution. French have too many written constitutions. But all that is not really the answering the question. Of course, every constitution is borrowed from other constitutions. But that is not answering the question of the Indian Constitution, the particular Indian Constitution which speaks of equality. So I'll just give you an example which is hounding my university today, and you are also part of it, your degrees come from JNU after all, which is hounding our university. And this question of freedom of speech is brought up. So one side says, and I'm not going to go into the actual controversy which all of you know about, though I'm afraid you know about it through the media, which is a very bad knowing, but still. What is the issue? The issue is that freedom of speech is fundamental. Freedom is fundamental, in other words. That is also the same thing as saying equality is fundamental. At the same time, you say, no, there has to be a restriction on freedom. Because in an actual situation, some things cannot be said which offend someone else's, freedom, you can put it like that, their status. And that is true. That is absolutely true. So every constitution, including the Indian one, puts restrictions on freedom. Now, but there is a category mistake here. People say so, people make a blanket statement now. At least one side makes a blanket statement that freedom is restricted. Always freedom, yes, freedom is a primary value of an Indian constitution, of the Indian constitution, which is a democratic constitution, but it is restricted. It has to be restricted. But that is a category mistake. You have brought two categories on the same level while they belong to two different levels. Freedom cannot be restricted. Freedom has to be what it is, which is not, freedom and restriction are contradictions. You can't have two words. You can't say restriction, freedom. It's a oxymoron. It's simply oxymoronic to say restricted freedom of speech. It's oxymoron. It makes no sense. Either you say restricted speech or you say freedom of speech in the sense of freedom. Now, of course, it is true, freedom of speech has restrictions in the law, in society, according to situations. That does not mean that freedom is restricted. And the law which gives us freedom and restrictions has to be based on something more than the law, which is the idea of freedom, which not all societies have or had. After all, society is based on religious sovereignty, God's sovereignty, theocracy, do not have freedom. And they are right from their perspective. They will say, how can we have freedom when God exists? God is the greatest figure. We are all under God. We cannot be free. Now that makes perfect sense if you believe in the axiom of God. Perfect sense. If someone says there is God, then it makes sense to say we are not free. But if you have said that we are free, humanity has freedom as its essential principle, then you cannot say that freedom is restricted fundamentally, axiomatically, generically. So there has to be substantive generic freedom, generic equality before you, of course, rightly in law, according to the Constitution, say that there are restrictions on that freedom. There are restrictions according to situation. Now this is something I've taken some time to explain to you because it is really crucial. Because the category mistake that we make by simply putting the two levels together and say, oh, the restricted freedom of speech or restricted freedom is basically speaking nonsense. Because there is freedom, we can now decide on predicative issues to impose restrictions on ourselves. But that freedom itself cannot be restricted. Yeah? To that extent, thinking cannot be restricted. Yeah? So the element of freedom fundamentally is thinking, not empirical acts of speech here or there. Of course, with those respects, with predicative acts of speech, what particularly you say about what, you can always have arguments. So now, in that sense, political equality, political democracy is not simply a formal question. When you have declared political democracy, then you have declared something generically. But how did you do it? From where did you do it? You did it out of particulars. You did it out of Mahad, out of temple entry, out of many such things, including the national movement, which is also the equality between the colonized nations and the colonial nations, which is the equality of nations. These are all particular predicative equalities. But finally, out of this, you have been able to extract a kind of generic particular. So politics is actually not simply political freedom in the sense of, the constitutional clauses, right of assembly, right of speech, right of voting and all of that. That is all there. But politics is the particular which actually stands for the universal. Well, society is the real society which has inequalities. Of course, you can also reverse this. So Marx, for instance, will say, and Ambedkar will say, they are absolutely at agreement on this, that human beings socially, so this also brings up the question of fraternity. You know, the three French Revolution slogans: liberty, equality, fraternity. Till now we have spoken of freedom, liberty and equality, but also fraternity. Fraternity is something like man's social nature, human beings' social nature, men and women. I keep using the gender term man, which is terribly wrong, but that is how in those days people used to speak. But whatever. Now, when you speak about equality as something like social equality, then you're also saying the same thing that you say from the angle of politics. In politics, you say politics stands for a kind of equality which is an equality as an idea of everybody having the potential of practicing equality in our lives, how to change our lives. From the social angle, what you say is that equality is something which is the generic nature of human beings. So human beings have a generic social nature. Human beings are social in a generic sense, and that is not the society of the Hindus or the Muslims or the Christians, where there is clear inequality. So all religions, sorry, I have to say this very clearly, nearly all religions have had an ambiguous relationship to equality. You have examples of tremendous equality in some moments and tremendous inequality in others. But man's social nature cannot be reduced to his or her religious community or other communitarian identities. So Marx would say human nature in its normal naturalness is social, but it gets perverted in history. Ambedkar would say the same thing, that human beings are social, but religions may produce antisocial behavior. So about Hindu society, he will say caste society as Hindu society is antisocial, because it produces within society a kind of social gradation of one part of society looking at the other part as an enemy or as a subhuman, as an untouchable, literally the word untouchable. So society produces its opposite, which is anti-society, antisocial. But generically human beings, generic humanity is social and equal, egalitarian. That is from the angle of social being. But from the angle of politics, you can say politics is the name of practicing politics, which means social change of relationships of human beings, but it is not done only predicatively on this issue or that issue, economic, temporal and religious. It is done on the ground of generic essence, which is again equality in the political sense. So both from the angle of society and from the angle of politics, there is an argument for generic equality, which then becomes constituted as a democratic law. And of course, democratic law will always have restrictions, no doubt about it. But we must remember that democratic law is grounded, which is always finite law. Ambedkar himself says, we make this constitution for our generation. We don't want to hold further Indian generations hostage to one constitution, which doesn't mean that the constitution will be abandoned, which means that the constitution is always disposed to amendment. It's always disposed to be adapted, to respond. Constitutions are responsive. Yeah. Now, if it is responsive, then it will respond to the question not just of the constitution, but the question of human equality and human freedom at the generic level. Because, in other words, to put it in a slightly philosophical formulation, the finite constitution has to be based on an infinite egalitarian and further libertarian and fraternal hypothesis. This is the generic idea. So it is a difficult idea, but I would like you to think about it seriously. So now the final part. Now you see, all of this has been still put too abstractly. It is still put at the level of the discourse of concepts and collective expressions of the concept in struggles in particular situations. In 1956, in December, of course, Ambedkar dies. But in that very year, he was working with frenetic energy while he was so ill, with frantic and lucid energy. He wrote one of the greatest books of religion, which is not religion at all in the simple sense, which is Buddha and his Dhamma. And as you would know, that is also the book of the times when he and lakhs of others converted the lower castes from Hinduism to Buddhism. I am again not going to talk about the conversion here, but the book. Now, just about a little before that book, he wrote an article which is called Marx or Buddha. And he brings up a very, very interesting point. He says that, look, Marx also spoke of equality and he wanted an egalitarian society. So did Buddha. Buddha and Marx, both of them spoke of equality. They didn't believe in any, the thing I spoke of earlier, some other generic superior sovereign essence like God, under which everyone will be unequal vis-a-vis God. Either of them didn't believe in that. But he said, from his point of view, that there is one difference between Marx and Buddha. With Marx, what you have is absolutely brilliant analysis of conditions of inequality in human society, from the very beginning up to capitalism. And from there, of course, because of the obvious thesis and the persuasive thesis on exploitation, you do feel the need to somewhere bring about an equal society. But that, in a sense, marks the limit of Marx. Beyond that, of course, other things will come in revolutionary politics, party and all that. We don't want to go into that today. But in Buddha, what you have is something further, in a sense, crossing of the threshold. In Marx, that question remains very difficult to answer. From where will we get the will to bring equality? We need equality. Equality is something which follows from the unhappy condition of exploitative condition of inequality. But from where will we get the will, the disposition to equality? How will, and disposition has to be understood very concretely. As bodies, how will we relate to other bodies equally? And here clearly gender becomes a crucial paradigm, because after all, gender is a case of bodies disposing themselves unequally vis-a-vis the power of bodies in relation to other bodies. Not just women, but transgenders and the whole continuum of gender, because gender is not just a binary, gender is a continuum. The fourth schema, which is based on Buddha and his Dhamma and the idea of dispositional equality. As I was saying, the dispositional equality is the question of equality actually in its most real and material state, which is equality as our bodies dispose ourselves to other bodies and to ourselves. And here we could refer to another essay by Ambedkar, which is Buddha or Marx, where he says that both Buddha and Marx are deeply concerned with inequality in society, in religion, in human interaction. Now, in Marx, in our times, in the modern times, produces by far the most brilliant and instructive critique of inequality in society, both in modern capitalist society, but also the history of inequality from earlier societies. And the history of inequality, which culminates in capitalist exploitation as a very persuasive theory of inequality in society, gives us clearly an imperative, a kind of ethical imperative, that we must bring into our world an equal society, or at least a thinking of equal society. That is okay. But what we still don't quite get, according to Ambedkar, from Marx is something like a disposition to equality. From where will this imperative eventually lead to actual active equal lives? From where will we, in a sense, become habitually equal? Not just conceptually so, but habitually. Our habits. So disposition is also clearly lodged, embedded in the habits of our bodies. And our bodies are not simply our bodies are also ourselves insofar as we conduct ourselves. So everything that we do, if you think about it concretely, is actually an act of the body. When I am speaking, you might think I am speaking ideas and about ideas, but if you look at it closely and simply, then you see it is my body which is producing whatever effect it is producing on your bodies. And in a way, bodies are where eventually lives are led, lives are unfolded in that element of bodies. And there, as I was saying, gender becomes a crucial site where bodies, and not just men and women, but the continuum of gender positions and gender possibilities, when bodies dispose themselves vis-a-vis other bodies in extreme range of conducts and behaviors, including great violence and great affection, love, but the opposite of love, hate, fear. So inequality in a way is found in the different dispositions and emotions which a body habitually radiates vis-a-vis other bodies. And as I keep saying, vis-a-vis other bodies and vis-a-vis itself. So Ambedkar's question was, from where will our bodies then transform themselves vis-a-vis themselves and others in life, in the world, in society, such that a kind of egalitarian disposition will become the general rule? And he didn't quite find that in Marx. He found a critique which was amazing, which was absolutely unique. But he was also looking for what you could call an affirmative theory of equality, which is deeply embedded, or not just embedded, but deeply rooted in the thought of the body, in the thought of disposition, habits. And interestingly, he thought Buddha gave him some help there. With Buddha, what you have is a way of looking at dispositions as themselves the ground on which equality has to be enacted in the world. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that he takes Buddha's teachings as they are and just produces a new version of Buddha's teachings in a kind of new form of the old content. Not at all. We know Buddha and his Dhamma is a book which is a kind of new Buddhism or a new thought of Buddhism. Buddhism which itself is not the same Buddhism, but and not just merely an interpretation, but you could even say an invention of Buddhism for our times and in our times. But I don't want to go into the details of the book itself. Some people would say a rational Buddhism, but then Buddhism itself is deeply rational in terms of its philosophical moorings, and it's atheistic. But let's not talk about Buddhism in detail. You can ask those questions if you want in discussion. But what I'm talking about is really the main stakes of that book in relation to the overall concern that I put to you, which is the stakes of equality as it is lived dispositionally, and that means through bodies and the habits of the bodies. And there he found Buddha or Buddhism or the teachings of Buddha to be some kind of a constructive point of his own transition into that phase of his thinking, which moved from the axiomatic and the generic conceptual declarations of equality to something like a life lived equally, dispositionally. But of course, for that you have to talk about conversion, because after all, from where will the disposition itself come as a change from the old habits, from the old dispositions, which are clearly unequal, which are inegalitarian when you take the experience of his own experiences with Hindu society, with Brahmanical society. Now their conversion becomes very important, because in a way conversion is to convert from one set of dispositions to another set of dispositions. But then that is not habit, that is a decision. So in a way, thought, what is an axiom? Axiom is a kind of decision of thought, no? Axiom is a decision. When you say equality, equality is a decision. Conversion is also a decision. So what kind of a decision is it? It is a decision which is to decide to now live another disposition. And a name to that disposition is given, Buddhism. And at a mass level, and it has a kind of messianic power. Lakhs of, till now, have followed an Ambedkarite path of Buddhism. But what I'm saying is, that path always recalls that decision. So in a way, the decision cannot be itself simply a radiation of the body. The decision is always thought which penetrates the body. But body then carries out that thought in its life. And hence, in the moment of conversion, Ambedkar also prescribed new oaths, new vows, which were not part of any old Buddhist canon or Buddhist text. These were all Ambedkar's own inventions, but they were inventions towards new dispositions, new habits, new forms of life. So this, in a sense, completes, for the moment at least, the four schematic aspects of the larger idea of equality. Through Ambedkar, but it is not clearly only a particular great thinker's own biography of or his trajectory of how he thinks as a philosopher or as a thinker about an idea. It is more a question of the idea itself, how it finds in particular historical conjunctures, in particular historical problems, a conceptual voice in that thinker. Because it's not as if only Ambedkar has thought about it. Buddha himself is one such conceptual figure, Marx is another, and you can, Periyar in India is another conceptual figure. There are many names here, but a name after all is also something like a decision. So when I speak of Ambedkar, I have decided to speak through Ambedkar, but it is not only something like a pure translation of Ambedkar's ideas. I have to also take responsibility for my own statements, which I would, absolutely like to do. So I think that is enough for the moment, and I would really like responses and questions.